Hi. In our last video, we talked about public versus private APIs and how we can access private APIs using system users and subscription services. Today, we're going to be talking about a topic that we brushed on called policies. So, policies are basic instruments that we use to add further protection to our APIs. Uh, if you notice, I'm currently in the Hello World API that we set up. You see something here called global policies. And if you were to go to your endpoints, and then just get into the one endpoint that we do have, if we scroll to the bottom, we see another one here called security policies. So, these two policies are the same. As you see it here, it says security policies as well. Only difference is that the global policies apply on a global scope, whereas the endpoint specific policies apply on a local scope. All right, so before we dive into what global scope and local scope mean, let's just brush over what policies actually are. So if I were to pull up the form and I just click on the add button to add a global policy, I can see the options for policies. So here it's IP whitelist, IP block list, request host whitelist, request host block list, and HTTP protocol. So basically, with IP whitelist, what this means is that you get to list out the IP addresses that are allowed to interact with the API. So you could put in any IP address you want or any number of IP addresses that you do want, and only these IP addresses will be allowed access to your API endpoint. You get to set the response message and the response code as well. The same thing applies to IP block list, right? The same concept. On the this time around, the IP addresses listed here are basically not allowed. So any other IP address might be allowed, but for sure, the ones listed here are definitely not allowed. And you can set your fail message and your response code. The same concept also applies to the request host. So basically, if you wanted to implement some kind of course where you wanted um, maybe only specific sites to have access to this API, you would put it in here that you would list the sites, the domains. I could say maybe www.mydomain.com. Maybe only this domain has access, or let's say I want to prevent a specific domain from having access to my API. I can say www.baddomain.com. And this could be as many as you want. Like you can set the fill message and the response code. So that's the general idea of policies. It's just extra tools to help you further protect your APIs. So let's paint this scenario. So you have an API that is exposed to the public, right? But perhaps you want only specific IP addresses to have access to this API. This would be a perfect way to accomplish that objective. So instead of having to create system users, having to pass around API keys, you could basically just set a range of API of IP addresses that you can whitelist, and only these IP addresses will be able to only requests originating from these IP addresses will pass through to actually run your function. So this is some really, really powerful tool, and you see how easy it is to implement. That's one of the beauties of the in-house cloud platform. We're not going to save this, but I just wanted to show you what policies are, the kind of policies that we have, explain how they work. So when a request comes in, we check to see, hey, does this API or does this endpoint have policies? If it does this request match the policy? And if it does, we pass it along. If not, it gets dropped. So let me refresh the page because I don't want to save any of this. So now let's talk about global policies versus local policies. So the same policies are exist at the endpoint level is the exact same thing. Now the only difference is that when the policy is set globally, that policy applies to all endpoints. When a policy is set locally in an endpoint, that is an endpoint specific policy. So basically, this gives you the freedom to add policies, at scale. Let's say you had 10, 20 APIs, but you wanted to add the same policy to all of them. You could accomplish that by basically, um, at the top level, assigning the policy globally. And then, but here's how it contrasts. If you have the same policy globally and locally, the local policy supersedes the global policy. So if I had an IP whitelist at the global level, but I wanted a different IP whitelist for a specific API endpoint, I would just go to that endpoint and set the security policy directly in that endpoint, and that would accomplish this objective. So let's go ahead and test out this whole concept of uh, policies. So I'm just going to go over to the details. This API is indeed exposed to the public. If I were to go to the endpoint and I were to go to my Postman, I currently have it set up. I can ping it and get my hello message. If I were to change the name, the message will change to reflect the new name in the route parameter. All right. So now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to set a policy on a local level. I'm going to set a whitelist policy. And I'm going to say that I only want this IP address to have access to this API. I'm going to save this. I'm going to go to the configurations tab. I'm going to deploy this current version to my development environment because that is what I'm testing. All right. I'm going to pull back Postman and I'm going to ping this API endpoint. As you can see, I get a message called failed validation with a 200 OK response code. Now, if I were to go back to my API endpoint, go back to this policy and change the message to failed validation, better luck next time, and change this to, let's say, 401. Save it, deploy the current version to the development environment, go back. I get the error message, failed validation, better luck next time, with a 401 unauthorized response code. So we see this API is exposed to the public, but is still secure without an API key. That is the whole point of policies, because with most businesses, as you would know from your business, you probably have a range of IP addresses in your internal network. You might not feel the need to have API keys for many different endpoints, as opposed to just using a trusted range of API of IP addresses, and this makes that workflow easy for you. All right. So in this lecture, we've gone over policies. We know that policies are instruments that help us further secure APIs and API endpoints. We know we've gone over the different types of policies and how they work. We understand that there are global policies and there are local policies. We understand that when there is a global policy that is the same with a local policy, the local policy supersedes the global policy. And with that, we'll wrap it up. Um, I'll see you in the next video. Thank you.